Tony has been going there for 70 years. And I tell you, for past 8 years, I will sit with him because he knew me and I knew him, and we have done it over the Labour Party conferences as well. And people will come get his autographs, and I'm sitting there. He was becoming a bit, I think he was listening loud. So when people speak very softly, he will ask me what he has said, and I will repeat it. And then I will take him to the platform where he used to sit in the corner chair, and I made sure that Rotary Bickerstaff sit on that chair, and I told him, look, we are missing Tony, but we don't want to miss you next time. So carry on fighting, and he is going to fight. So I think we will remember Tony. I have attended his hundreds of memorial meetings. The last one was on 5th of June, which I attended in Camden Town Hall, and there were over 1,000 people there, and I'm expecting Jeremy and others to come and speak about him. Let me finish here. This is a sad day for us that we don't have Tony Benn with us. We are looking for another Tony Benn. We have not found yet. I hope we can get one in this century who can stand for equality, who can stand for human rights, who can stand for oppressed people. And I think when people ask me what Third World Solidarity has achieved, I tell them that in 2007, Hilary, Benn, son of Jeremy Khalid and Jeremy, son of Tony Benn, came to our meeting in Ackley Street, and he promised his Third World Solidarity had been campaigning for years that we want resolution of United Nations to be fulfilled, that 0.7% of GDP should be paid as a development fund to the third world country. Hilary promised that, and this government has committed to it, and they have achieved it. So I think Third World Solidarity, one achievement you can say, that we have achieved 0.7% of GDP given for development of third world countries. And the second achievement is that we raise the voice of voiceless people. And I will just tell you a very important message which I received from Ethiopian community. Their opposition leader and Secretary General of their opposition was kidnapped, abducted on 23rd of June by Yemeni's government in collaboration with the Ethiopian government, and he is taken to Ethiopia. He's a British citizen. I know Jeremy Corbyn is leading his case. Thank you very much for mentioning that. So we, the Third World Solidarity, is proud to raise the voices of those who are forgotten or who are lost in our normal lives. So let's carry on it. That was Tony Benn's mission, and Third World Solidarity will fulfill it. Can I ask you to, I think, stand for 1 minute in the memory of Tony Benn, and then I will invite them. Thank you very much. I know I think she will be speaking on behalf of Third World Solidarity tonight. So can I ask Victoria?
Thank you. May I be allowed 1 or 2 comments on that as well? Thank you. In fact, my association with Third World Solidarity is more recent than Tony Benn's relationship with the organization. But as Mushtaq Lasharie has said, his link and his support for Third World Solidarity goes to the very origin of the organization. And what a champion we have had in Tony Benn. His ideals are humbly reflected in the ideals of Third World Solidarity, the ideals of internationalism, of democracy as a full participatory and indeed a radical project, equality and rights. And as Mushtaq has said also, the question of those people whose voices are not normally heard. And I think this is where also it's my personal view, but I think I speak for my colleagues. When Tony Benn spoke, he was, of course, articulate, he was clear, he was passionate, but he was also always informed. When you heard Tony Benn speak, you learned something. He was drawing on history, and I think this is a really important lesson. Not only because history has lessons which are not transparent and they're not easy to learn, but they're there for us to think about and take forward. And I think not only do we learn from the histories, which are again the histories of those that become invisible, the other histories, the histories that don't always get into the public domain and the history books, and increasingly possibly there is a risk of this, the importance of learning from the past. And also within that, this ability to have a broad brush of history and a broad brush of the world, of understanding the complexities of the world we live in, while at the same time paying a lot of attention to the minutiae of everyday lives. Everyday people and their struggles were as important as the big events in history. And I think this is a lesson that is an enduring lesson. And so in a way I would like to just reflect on another issue which is related to third world solidarity, which is that of legacy. Tony Benn's legacy, but also I think our mission is to transmit values and knowledge and understanding and an enthusiasm for action and participation amongst the young. And so I have one event that Mushtaq Lasharie was reminding me of today, which was 3 years ago, an event organized by Third World Solidarity for the under-25s, and all the speakers were young people, and it was to commemorate the 9/11. And Tony Benn was sitting in the back row, and Mushtaq Lasharie, seeing him, invited him to come forward and maybe say something. And as I understood it from you, he said, this time I'm listening, I'm here to listen. And that reminded me also, he became an honorary graduate at Westminster where I teach. And I remember walking into the field after the ceremony where all the students had received their diplomas. And there he was, surrounded by students and their families, grandmothers, and talking as though these were long-lost friends. And indeed, maybe they were long-lost friends. So this ability to listen, I think, the humility of listening and paying attention to ordinary people, to everyday lives, and I think that's, again, something that we can transmit to the next generation. So, finally, this event that Mushtaq Lasharie has referred to, which is also to do with listening and with respect and with understanding. There's no way we can go forward in understanding or dialogue unless we learn to listen. And this is, I think, an excellent example of Tony Benn's ability to do it with enormous grace and panache. This was an event in Wilston Green, as you mentioned, and one of the things that impressed me as a member of the audience, I didn't understand much of what was going on either, but that he was also honoured in that event, and he was given a traditional Sindhi ajlak, which is a beautiful cloth which was bestowed on him as an honour, and which he accepted and acknowledged with great, I think, gratitude and again elegance. So I'm going to read from his own diaries. This is More Time for Politics, highly recommended. And this is an entry on Sunday the 6th of May. In the evening, I went to the May Day celebrations at the Pakistani Centre up in Wilson Green. There were about 150 people there. I sat on the platform and I didn't really know who they were, which is so difficult. And then most of the meeting was conducted in Urdu. And I sat and clapped when other people clapped, and I looked wise. I'm going to take my glasses off. My eyesight's not what it used to be. There was one beautiful poem read by author Mahmood, who's a filmmaker and makes programs for Channel 4. And this is the poem. You want to speak of war, I want to speak of peace. You say punish, I say forgive. You speak of God's wrath, I speak of his mercy. Your Quran is a weapon, my Quran is a gift. You speak of the Muslim Brotherhood, I speak of the Brotherhood of Man. You like to warn others, I like to welcome. You like to speak of hell, I like to speak of heaven. You talk of lamentation, I talk of celebration. You worship the Lord, I worship the divine. You want silence, I want music. You want death, I want life. You speak of power, I speak of love. You search out evil, I want the good. You dream of the sword, I sing of the rose petal. You say the world is the desert, I say the world is a garden. You prefer the plain, I prefer the adorned. You want to destroy, I want to build. You want to go back, I want to move forward. You are busy denying, I am busy affirming. Yet there might be one thing on which we see eye to eye. You want justice, so do I.
The speaker about Palestine today, which Tony Benn would have spoken if he was here today. Jeremy Corbyn.
Mushtaq, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to say some words tonight. And it's a great honour to be invited to do that. And I think it's great that Hilary is here. And I think Hilary should be speaking first, actually. But being held to the last, are you, Hilary? Not quite. In memory of Tony, it's actually quite difficult to summarise so much of what he did in internationalism and of all the different groups he supported, the ways he was able to inspire large numbers of people to undertake tasks they hadn't hitherto thought they could do. And his support for this group was very strong indeed, and I think one of the greatest events was when you had Noam Chomsky speaking here. And it seemed to me that there is a generation of people, Tony, Noam Chomsky, Benn, many, many others, who've given a huge contribution, not just to the principles of international solidarity and justice, but also their ability to communicate across generations, across nationalities, across language, which is something that Tony was spectacularly good at doing. As you mentioned, Mushtaq, in introducing me, I'm chair of Stop the War Coalition, but I'm also chair of Liberation. And it's in that capacity I want to say a word first. Britain is obviously a former imperial power, and there's an awful lot of imperial pretentiousness about attitudes in the Foreign Office and foreign policy, and indeed pervade this building to this day. And we also have a legacy of issues that Britain and its colonial past has created around the world, Palestine being just one of them. In the 1920s and 30s, there was a huge debate in the labour movement about whether or not there should be the idea of dominion and self-governing status for British colonies that would essentially remain part of Britain, or whether there should be a move towards independence. The French debate was even more intense, and they moved very strongly towards making overseas territories a department of France. Britain, generally speaking, didn't, but that debate nevertheless went on. The turning point in the thirst for independence was the Pan-African Unity Conference at Chawton-cum-Harley Town Hall in 1945 in Manchester, when many African leaders, all of whom went on to become leaders of their own countries, forged an alliance calling for self-government and then independence for mainly at that time African colonies. Remember, Britain was going through a period of the most unbelievable treble standards. The first standard was the good one, and that was the very good domestic policy that the post-war Labour government had on National Health Service, public ownership, council housing, so many things. The bad side of it and the good side of it, the foreign policy. There was an undertaking that independence would come to India. Unfortunately, that was accompanied by a partition, which in itself is a huge debate. But there was also the predilection of that government to engage in colonial wars in Kenya and in many other places. And the brutality and the behaviour of the British Armed Forces in Kenya, not just Kenya, but many other places, was absolutely appalling. Many who were on the left of the Labour Party and had indeed supported the APPG government in its domestic policy, but been critical of its foreign policy, and particularly of the foundation of NATO, such as Fenner Brockway and others, came together in 1954 to found the Movement for Colonial Freedom. And Tony was there at the foundation meeting. Fenner Brockway was there with many others, and Tony was Movement for Colonial Freedom's first treasurer. And he performed those duties very well, and the Movement for Colonial Freedom grew very quickly. and was an important factor in pressurising MPs and pressurising the British government and supporting independence movements in Africa. And in particular, what was happening in Kenya, where the Mau Mau rebellion was taking place. The British media, I remember growing up with this as a small child, were full of stories about Mau Mau atrocities and Mau Mau abuse, and how every European was at risk in Kenya. It was a travesty of the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation was that British colonial forces were desperate to hang on to the land and the power in Kenya, and the British Army was supporting them in doing that. And of course it suited them therefore to pillory all those that were calling for independence. Tony, as a Member of Parliament, quite a young Member of Parliament at the time, very bravely, along with a very small number of others, raised the issue of the treatment of Mau Mau people in concentration camps organised by the British Army. And then fast forward, last summer, which is what, 60, 70 years later, the British Foreign Secretary gets up in Parliament and comes within a scintilla of giving a general apology for the behaviour of British forces. Why? Because of the campaign of the Mau Mau people for justice, and it was a sort of poignant moment. I was in the High Court with them when they actually were presenting their case and indeed won their case in the High Court. These are people that have been disgracefully treated by the British Army. And amongst the information given were pamphlets produced by MCF, Movement for Colonial Freedom at the time, Liberation as it now is, and of course the speeches and questions raised by Tony and many others in Parliament at that time. So there's this idea that Tony came to internationalism and international politics much later in his life. It's simply not true. Hilary, I'm sure, will confirm this. It was always there. It was always there from his experiences in the Second World War, from the loss of his brother, and his utter faith in the principles of the United Nations Charter and universal human rights. I have this memory of meeting, I met Tony obviously many years ago, when I was first elected here, getting to know Fenner Brockway quite well. And I always liked Fenner, because however old I was, he always called me young man. I thought it was great. He wouldn't keep calling somebody young man, has got to be a nice chap. And Fenner and Tony were fascinating to talk to. I was a newly elected member, and I just wished I'd carried a camera with me. These days there's a camera for everything. That in the Riverside cafeteria, the members' area of the cafeteria as used to be, I took my young son Ben, who was then about 6 to 9 months old, into the room. He was being completely happy, he wouldn't shut up, he was howling, crawling around, getting on my nerves. And like any young father, he was getting deeply stressed by this child's misbehaviour. And so Tony picked him up, stuck him on Fenner Brockway's lap and pulled up a chair next to him. So there was this wonderful image of Ben sitting on Fenner Brockway's knee being fed by Tony Benn. What a great memory for a child. So Tony then remained with Liberation and still was a member right to his unfortunate passing, and came to our anniversary event. He's always been incredibly supportive of liberation and of international causes and international justice. And so when we had many rallies in Trafalgar Square in support of many causes, and sometimes you take up causes and you realise this is going to be a long, hard road to fight, taking the cause of justice. Tony would sort of reflectively stand on the plinth in Trafalgar Square and say, well, we stood here in 1964 when Mandela was in prison, and we were here long enough to see him come out of prison and go into South Africa House, and all those decades and decades of campaigning. And it's Tony's understanding of popular movements, what motivates people, and always seeing and searching for the good in people rather than the bad in people. That is something that I think we will always treasure and thank him for. In the Gulf War of 1990-1991, Tony was a very, very important parliamentary figure, and indeed went to Iraq to try and promote the peace process. And then later on, when the war with Iraq came up, helped to found the Stop the War Coalition, which he was president. And as Mushtaq was saying, we have this appreciation of him at the camping centre few weeks ago, and it was absolutely full for the whole evening. And the problem was shutting people up and getting them off the stage rather than anything else. But it was a marvellous evening, and the affection that there was for Tony right across the age, ethnic groupings, political thoughts and everything else was utterly extraordinary, something that I'll never forget. Last point I want to make is this. Tony used his position in Parliament in many ways, and it must have been extraordinarily difficult for him as a cabinet minister in the 1960s and 1970s, when he clearly had a lot of differences within the cabinet, but he was brilliant at the nuanced mixed message of saying what was really going on in cabinet without ever breaking any cabinet secrets. It was pretty obvious what he thought about lots of things. He always took the view that he had to stay in office to achieve the best he could, and I think we have a lot to thank him for, both of his time as early on as Postmaster General, later Industry and Energy Secretary, and the inspiration he gave to many in the workplace, engineering and other people, that it was possible for a government to make a difference. It was possible for a government to promote cooperatives, promote a different way of working, listen to workers' concerns. And as you've heard me say this before, I've never forgotten the way that he handled the whole British Leyland Rolls-Royce crisis and the public ownership of shipbuilding and engineering in the 1970s, when he went out of his way, not just to consult union leaderships who had often slightly different agendas from others, but to make sure that he was actually in touch with the shop stewards movement in all the factories in this country, and said, look, the way forward for industry in this country is actually to harness the skill, the ambition and the imagination of ordinary workers, of what they can achieve and what they can achieve in life. He was a man that believed in peace in the world, campaigned all his life for peace in the world, stood against apartheid, against nuclear weapons, stood against the H-bomb in the 1950s, and throughout his life was one that was a beacon for peace and justice in the world. And independence has brought many benefits to many people all around the world, but it's also brought a recolonisation through global commercial power, through global military power, and through the global arms industry. And those are the issues that we now have to grapple with. And if you read his diaries, particularly the last 5 to 10 years of diaries, these were issues that he was grappling with all the time, through Stop the War Coalition, through Liberation, through Third World Solidarity movements, for all kinds of things, where he was discussing these issues, essentially about the power and good of ordinary people to protect our planet, to stop wars, to bring about social justice, as against those who benefit from inequality, wars, and injustice within our society. And he taught me a fantastic amount in my life, and I'll be forever grateful for being a good friend to him throughout his life. It was one of the great pleasures of my life to have known him so well, and it's really nice that we're here tonight to celebrate his life. Thank you.
And just to say a few words about the great Tony Benn. Tony, from a very early age, when I joined the Labour Party, was always somebody that we aspired to, somebody that we looked up to, because he always spoke for the interests of those who weren't able to speak for themselves. That showed me what the Labour Party stood for in my early years of being in the Labour Party, because I believe thoroughly that what the Labour Party was about. It was about looking at the equality, looking at justice for people who were not able, perhaps in some terms, to look after their own interests and to do that. And as I became more and more involved in the Labour Party and in politics, and the further higher you go up, you tend to sometimes slip away from those great words and the principles of Tony Benn. But I think it was always interesting, as far as I was concerned, that there was some lever that always pulled you back. Because whenever he spoke, he guided you back to where you should be, as a Labour politician, as a socialist in this country, who understood what the meaning of the word being a socialist was, and what the Labour Party stood for. And sometimes when it didn't quite stand for what it should have stood for, he let us all know where the party should be, and we all had to at least listen and take heed of some of the words he was saying. He's a great man, and may he rest in peace. I don't think any of us can emulate what he's done but we need more of those free thinkers who are able to ensure that we stick to our principles. And a huge tribute to Tony Benn and what he gave me personally in terms of guidance throughout the Labour Party being a member of that party. Thank you.
It's indeed an honour and a privilege to be standing here amongst all these great people and to be paying tribute to his great son of our times, Tony Benn. He was a friend of people, he was a friend of many movements, and today Palestinians feel orphaned indeed, as he is not there to raise his voice at BBC. The way he ripped the BBC apart in one of his very famous interviews is a legend and is an inspiration. And I have actually shared that clip with all my children to see how he sidelined the BBC reporters or the anchor person, and he just took the courage and read all that he had to read. That is all I really wanted to say. There's so much that you could carry on, but it's all been said.
Of the Durham Miners Association. But he was so much more, a visionary, an inspiration, and a light in the darkness. We may never see his life again, which would be a tragedy for future generations. You meet tonight as internationalists who believe that we are all the same, despite our ethnic, cultural, or political origins, and Tony would say aye to that. Please remember my comrade fondly tonight, and in his memory, carry on your work in his name. Thank you.
By the performance of the Third World Solidarity, today they are making history by paying tribute to one of the greatest luminary of the 20th and 21st century, the great Tony Benn, who rejected the imperial as well as imperialistic regalia. You live in England, try to understand English. He is a gentleman who left the crown and he joined the masses. People of and leaders of Pakistan must learn from him. You cannot find one penny illegally on the name of Tony Benn. But whereas in Pakistan, people...
And who was that? Tony Benn. He said, I did not have the courage to ask a prophet not to do it. Prophet. So he was a prophet to many people. He was certainly indeed. And I was not the only one, many people believe that. And that's what I wanted.
Thank you very much, Dr.
But Tony Benn was not just a good listener, and he did not just listen to the faint and feeble voices of the third world. He articulated their aspirations, and that was what made Tony Benn Tony Benn. A politician concerned about the sufferings of people across the globe, is the true humanist from the historical center of, historical center of imperialism. He stood for the colonies and the oppressed people in the colonies. He contradicted himself in some respects. He fought against himself and his own identity, his own people, but he fought with the strength of ideas. And the ideas that Tony Benn sired, the ideas that he disseminated, the ideas that he articulated are the ideas that we must carry forth and carry on with beyond his life. He is no longer with us, but his ideas are, and ideas do not die with people. Thank you.
The whole of human history, the whole history of struggle and progress, is that gradually, if it's a good idea and it wins enough support, it wins the day. And then, and this is the ultimate truth, 5, 10, 15 years later, you can't, as Dad would say, you couldn't find anyone who wasn't in favour of the idea in the first place. But that's a reminder of where we have come from, the struggle that was involved, and where we ended up. And I think it is quite fitting, actually, that the last speech that my father ever gave in public was over in Westminster Hall in December of last year, where he came to take part in the memorial event for Nelson Mandela, because we had our tributes in the House of Commons, in which I was able to take part, and then Dad came to Westminster Hall and spoke about the cause that has brought us together this evening. And the very final thing I want to say about him is he was a socialist and a proud socialist, but he also was an inheritor of what was a radical, dissenting political tradition. As he wrote in his diaries, his mum, my grandmother, taught him that you should pay more attention to the prophets than you do to the kings. She was a great Bible scholar, and he was profoundly influenced by the place of faith in the world. And his father, William, who ironically had been Secretary of State for India between 1929 and 1931, which was the cause of Dad meeting Nanny when he was a young child, taught him many things. One of the things he taught him were these words of a famous Salvation Army hymn, which I think best sums up what Dad believed in and why he was as he was. And those words very simply say, and it was the title of one of his books, dare to be a Daniel. Dare to stand alone. Dare to have a purpose firm. Dare to make it known. And for me, those 4 lines sum up what my father's life was devoted to, was all about. Because he absorbed those words and the meaning that they bring and brought to him and to us at a very young age, and the rest of his life he tried to live those out. And I am, on behalf of the whole of the family, incredibly grateful to all of you for coming this evening, for the comradeship that you showed him throughout his life, because it's about supporting one another in struggle, the good times, the bad times, and I know he appreciated that enormously, and we are greatly touched as his family by the many kindnesses that have been expressed since he died, for the kindness that you bestow upon him this evening by gathering for this memorial event, and to wish you all of the best in the fights and the struggles and the victories that are to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hilary, and don't you feel that you are the only family, 4 children and then many grandchildren, and I have read his 35 letter to his grandchildren, and they are also very visionary, and everybody should read them, in which he says that we are not leaving the world which our grandchildren deserve to live in, but I know that they have the vision, they have the ability and power, they need a will to do it. So I remember those words, and I hope you will read it. I've got many stories which I will be writing in my memoirs. It will be coming out next year, Aitzaz, and I will be